Discretionary listener participation is advised for the following pro wrestling podcast.
I want you to show me the way to listen to the Stick to Wrestling podcast. I want to thank Peter Frampton for writing that song about his favorite podcast, Stick to Wrestling. I'm John McAdam. Welcome to Stick to Wrestling, where if you give us 60 minutes, perhaps indeed, we will give you a rawbone podcast. Why am I talking so fast? This is the only wicked good podcast out there, and it is the People's Podcast. It is the Major League of Professional Wrestling podcast. And with that, I want to bring on my guest. It's been too long since we've had him on. I know I have said that a lot lately, which is a good problem to have because I have a lot of really good guests that need to come on soon, our former guests, and I have like a great crop of potential new guests. So like I said, great problem to have. Brandon, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks, man. I always appreciate coming on, and I got a tough few to follow. John was great last week with the two wrap-up deals, and he was awesome. Tamale's always great, so I'm just glad to be in the mix and appreciate it.
Oh, man, no one's more nervous than me because, I mean, it's like I'm asking myself, okay, did I peak at episode 136, I think it was? I mean, that's it's going to be a tough show to beat. I learned so much from John.
Yeah, it was amazing, and just having somebody that was there and just hearing all that was excellent. So definitely a great show.
Yeah, I mean, I thought I was going to have a hard time beating a fairly recent show where Thomas Bain and I went over the Ole Anderson / Dave Meltzer interview.
I forgot Thomas too. That was excellent as well.
Yeah,
that was
and
great.
We might have even beaten that one. So perhaps there's hope for the show getting better each and every week.
Absolutely.
All right. I have been looking forward to this. The last time we did this, it was just Sean and I, and we went to WrestlingData.com, which, you know what, Axel Salbach puts that out, and I want to thank him because it's an excellent site. I strongly recommend it. We are going to talk about results and shows from 40 years ago today, and this show comes out on January 21st, 2021. We're going to be talking about shows that happened on January 16th, 1981, and if we have time, we'll go to January 16th, 1991. Being the gentleman that I am, I let Brandon pick the show that we would go over first. It is Georgia Championship Wrestling from the Municipal Auditorium in Columbus, Georgia, on a Wednesday night. Brandon, first match, Charlie Cook defeated Bobby Eaton. Any thoughts on either of those stars?
Well, Eaton was obviously on his way up, and I don't remember Charlie Cook in Georgia at all, mostly just from Florida. I know he did a lot more than I'm aware of, but I honestly do not remember him ever being on the show unless I'm just forgetting. Eaton wasn't quite what he would become, but he was still really good at this point. He was definitely a high spot in Goulas around that time, one of the few bright spots
Yeah.
that he had left going. So I'm sure it was probably a pretty decent match. I was never a huge Charlie Cook fan and didn't see him a whole lot because I didn't get Florida. I saw him in the magazines and, had heard that he had played pro football. I don't know if any of that was actually true or not, but,
He said he played 7 years as a linebacker for the Pittsburgh Steelers. And I'm sitting there looking, listening to this going, okay, linebacker for the Steelers who are always on TV, and I've never heard of him. I don't think so.
Yeah, exactly. So, I'm sure it was a perfect opener for a Wednesday night in Columbus. I would have loved to have made it down for one of those spot shows, especially the weekly towns there. It was like a religion for him, I would have just been amazing to be able to go back and see some of that stuff.
Had I been born 5 years later, I guarantee you I would have spent at least a week in a car, like trying to hit every major circuit. Like, okay, this night we're going to see a Mid-Atlantic show. This night we're going to see a Georgia show, this night Florida, over to Mid-South. The car would break down at some point, but I'd have a hell of a week.
Yeah, I would have done the exact same thing, just a few years too early. And when you're 11 and 12, your folks might humor you here and there, but not as much as you'd like them to, unfortunately.
Oh, totally. Bobby Eaton, from the minute I saw him on Georgia TV, he was a guy, he had funny trunks. That was the one thing I remembered about him. He was a little chubby, but my God, he took bump after bump. Even as a non-smart fan, I saw how good he was. Charlie Cook, I think, is best known for getting buried in Ric Flair's autobiography like 20 years ago. He wasn't great, but he wasn't that bad. Had Rick not said anything, he would not have stood out as a particularly bad Florida champion. Florida would put their titles on guys that, they were experimenting with, quite frankly. And sometimes the experiments worked out. Like, Manny Fernandez got his first big push as Florida champion, and Charlie Cook just not as much.
Yeah, no, I agree. And somebody evidently liked him, personally. And I'm not sure who would have been booking right at that time. Would it have been maybe Dory in '81 there when he was kind of big in Georgia? I'm not sure, but maybe it was sort of like the Rufus R. Jones thing. He wasn't much in the ring, but they loved the guy, and he was a hell of a cook, so they liked to have him around.
There you go. That makes sense. I mean, I think Dory was booking Florida when he was the Florida heavyweight champion. I'm pretty sure of that. And I think booking here is someone who's coming on the show in a couple of matches. Robert Fuller, I think, was booking Georgia at this point.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that.
All right, next match, Jerry Oates over Ron Cheatham. Any thoughts?
I barely remember Ron Cheatham. I think he pretty much always lost his matches.
Yeah.
On the show, Jerry Oates, the Oates brothers, I think didn't get as much credit as they should have. I think they were really good at times. They had some success in Central States as well. I wish they would have got pushed a little bit more, maybe. But yeah, I thought Jerry was a good wrestler, especially for the time. Mat based, not super flashy or anything like that, but for the time and what the sport was, I thought he was really good, actually.
Ted and Jerry Oates wrestled on the first Georgia match I ever saw, October 3rd, 1981. We finally got WTBS on cable. And I forget who they were wrestling, but they were the opening match. And they announced the participants, and then they said, all right, the match is going to start after a commercial. And I was like, no commercials. I've waited long enough for this. But shout out to my good friend Mark Oates, who is related to Jerry. I've known Mark for like 20 years online. Ron Cheatham is a guy who I know him as a jobber in Mid-South. I don't even remember him in Georgia. The thing I remember most about the Oates brothers, aside from, being the first match I ever saw on TBS, in '84, when Ole was running that early Saturday morning show on WTBS, they ran an angle where I think it was Ted Oates who turned heel and was part of the Fabulous Blondes tag team with Rip Rogers, who's one of the most underrated guys ever. And yeah, Jerry was definitely the good guy. And it was like there was friction between the Oates brothers, but it was never explained, and it quickly went away. Typical Georgia at that time.
Yeah, and that show was on so early, and I was, fairly young when that happened, and I still couldn't get up most of the time to watch it. So I didn't see a whole heck of a lot of that. For the nostalgia now, I've gone back to watch a little bit of it, but at the time I didn't see much of it at all, because it was where I was. I believe it was on at 6:35 a.m. And
yeah,
even at 14, that's kind of was in my want to sleep in kind of phase. So, but yeah, I thought the Oates brothers were pretty good, and they could have held various tag titles around. I'm not sure how much they traveled. I honestly only remember him from the Georgia and then the Central State stuff. And by then they were doing, I think it was after Sam had gone and the whole St. Louis thing had fallen apart. So I think they were getting some keel shots in there as well.
Hey, speaking of St. Louis falling apart, book recommendation for everyone, Larry Madison's book on the St. Louis promotion and its rise and fall. That was a really good book. Have you read that one?
Yes, I have. I think I probably got it right when it came out, and his Brody book as well. They were both pretty damn good and well worth reading about, just to read about Sam and how meticulous he was, and how he paid the bills forward all the time, and it had to kill him to see what it kind of became once O'Connor and Race and everybody got a hold of it. They just didn't do business right as far as Larry was concerned, but he'd watched Sam do it for, a long time, and he thought he knew the way, it should be done, and he just didn't like what it became, and we saw the result of it, so he was more than likely right,
I want to talk a little bit about something I read in Larry's book. It on the surface, people are going to be like, oh my God, that makes no sense, but I'll explain it. Larry made a point. He's like, what the hell does Harley Race know about booking? And you guys are like, whoa, wait a minute. What did you just say? But what he said makes sense. He's like, what does Harley Race know about promoting St. Louis? He flies in arrives at 4:00, comes to the arena, and is gone the next morning. What does he know? And it was a ballsy thing to say, but it made sense.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. He was there a lot, but he wasn't there every single day. And even with Central States, he wasn't there all the time, because obviously when he was champ, he was on the road. And even in the brief periods he wasn't, he was still traveling all the time. So I agree with that. Sam he did it so much like a sport, and he was so respected by the newspapers and the sports guys there. And God, just what a run, you start back in the 40s, you have to stop because the World War, and then you come back and you're battling with Dez, and, you end up winning out and taking over. And it's hard to argue with 30, 40 years of success like that.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
I mean, and just keeping on that subject briefly, I mean, maybe probably 7, 8 years ago, I heard Jim Cornette on Roddy Piper's podcast, and you could tell Roddy barely had any idea who Jim Cornette was, and he definitely didn't know who the Midnight Express were. I mean, Jim Cornette's like, oh, yeah, I managed the Midnight Express, and Piper's like, faking his way through. He's, oh, good boys, good boys. I'm like, oh, you don't know who but why does Roddy Piper have to know who the Midnight Express are? Some guys just kept their eyes on their own paper, and Piper, went from town to town, did his thing, and didn't worry about what was going on in the NWA.
Well, and it's sort of like you can relate it to bands. They're not keeping up on the newest thing, especially the older guys. They're concerned with what they're doing. And so, that's totally understandable, because hell, if you're wrestling all the time, the last thing you want to go do, unless you're going to maybe critique your own stuff or watch some older stuff, you're not going to go check everything new out. So,
wrestling is your life. You're going from town to town. You're doing it day in, day out. You're doing a ton of TV. The last thing you want to do is go home and watch more wrestling
of guys that you're not even familiar with. So, I'm sure some of them heard here and there, hey, check these guys out or whatever. And back then, VCRs, were you going to pack one on the road with you all the time? Take to the hotel room with you. So it was just tougher for them too. But it's sad because he missed out. They were a great team, but he's one of the greatest of all time as well. So
I'll give you an example. This is 1987. I'm in Philly. I'm with some of my friends. We're hanging out in a bar with Jim Cornette, Stan Lane, and Bobby Eaton, right? And they have AWA wrestling on in the bar. And Paulie Dangerously, Dennis Condrey, and Randy Rhodes are on the screen. And Road Warrior Hawk yells from across the room, hey, there's the real Midnight Express. And Stan Lane doesn't know what the hell's going on. Who are these guys? What? And why would Stan Lane watch AWA wrestling?
Right, exactly.
All right, enough of our sidebars. We'll be lucky if we get through this Columbus show. Third match, Steve O defeats the newly turned heel Kevin Sullivan. What do you got for us, Brandon?
I think that would have been a pretty decent match. I wasn't a huge Steve-O fan, and being that age, I sort of wondered why he was getting the push he got.
Being this age, I'm wondering why he got the push he got. But
he was just kind of really vanilla. But Kevin Sullivan was really coming on at this time. I'm guessing this is right when he sort of came back with the leaned out physique and just ripped and looked really incredible. And he wasn't quite as vicious as he would become, but it was getting there. And I liked him a lot more than just the year previous when he was in doing the stuff with Tony Atlas and all that. So I'm sure it would have been a good match, and I would put most of that on Sullivan. I hate to just tear down Steve-O, and I know his staph infection probably halted any real momentum he had going. I believe that's kind of what killed him and kept him out for a long time, at least in Georgia. But it probably could have been a fun match, and I'm sure the fans there were into it because there was a lot of girls down in Georgia that I'm sure went to the shows and thought he was cute and probably were screaming for him. So, but I think it could have been a decent match, especially for a Columbus spot show like that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Steve-O, I don't know if you guys know this. If you get a staph infection, you lose all of your charisma. No, that would imply that Steve-O had charisma before the staph infection. I don't mean to sit here and rag the guy, but he got a pretty big push in Georgia, and I just don't see it. The guy was a walking void of charisma. And even, as a kid, how old was I when this was going on? I was 15, and I'm just like, why is this guy getting so much TV time? Kevin Sullivan, on the other hand, my pal Kevin Sullivan, who we do a baseball forecast on one of the 605 specials with Brian Last every year. He went from this sort of a little bit chubby-ish Irish dude who, looked like he spent a lot of time on the bench press when he was with the WWF in like 76, 77. I mean, that's in a way, that's always how I'm going to remember him. But now I'm seeing him on cable, and he is shredded. I mean, he looked great during this run. He looked like a star waiting to happen. I know his height kind of worked against him, but I mean, he got so big, and he did great interviews. This was prime Kevin Sullivan, in my opinion, not the devil worshiper Kevin Sullivan that we would get in 82. Excuse me, but this is, to me, is the best Kevin.
Yeah, I agree. He did, and he had a great run in Memphis at the time as well. And I like this version way better than all the, devil stuff in Florida. And to me, he overcame the height thing a little better than your Mike Grahams and a few other guys. It just, I don't know. And I think that came with putting on, or, I don't know if he put on that much weight or he just got leaner, but he was in actual competition shape, and I think he did some legit, bodybuilding shows.
He did,
at least around, Tennessee and Kentucky or wherever. But he looked great, and his attitude changed. And like I said, somehow, some way, he overcame that height thing that so many other guys couldn't get past. Because at one time, even though it wasn't my favorite, he was sort of considered a monster heel there in Florida. And most 5'7", 5'8" guys, you don't consider a monster heel, but, he pulled it off, and they had a long run with it. And back to Steve-O, I can't believe he beat the Mongolian Stomper in the Omni, of all things, with a freaking airplane spin.
Yeah.
And it was just so, yeah. And you were right about his charisma, but maybe it was a good thing he got the staph infection and he was out for a while, and we were only subjected to the interviews then. But no ill will on the guy.
No.
And he came from an athletic family, but maybe Ole just liked him, or I guess it was Fuller at the time, but he got in somehow. And like I said, I can't believe he won the national title from the Stomper in the Omni. That's just mind blowing to me. And subbing for Dusty, I think, who'd been cracked over the head by Morocco or Don Carson or somebody, and ends up, taking the title then. So,
yeah, I was definitely taken aback. Kevin Sullivan had one of my favorite heel turns of all time. He's wrestling Steve Keirn for the TV title on Georgia TV, and they're doing a move where, like, Keirn, it's a babyface match, so Keirn backs up, and Sullivan suckers him, and he wins the match, wins the title, and Gordon Sullivan's like, hey, wow, what's going on? And Kevin Sullivan comes to the podium, and he's like, hey, the last thing the referee tells you is to protect yourself at all times. And Steve Keirn should have listened to the ref. I thought that was fantastic.
That was fantastic. And it wasn't just a complete, 180, I'm a devious evil heel now. It was cool. It was, and, I sort of kind of like the Tommy Rich Bill Dundee thing in Memphis, where he comes up and crotches him on the, leapfrog, and feigns, acting concerned for Dundee a little bit, and then pins him and takes the belt. So sort of the same kind of thing. And they were both effective, definitely. And it was exciting to see him that way.
Yeah, and then Tommy Rich goes over and terrorizes a helpless Jerry Lawler who has a broken leg. That was a great television segment. Match number 4 is a 6-man tag team match, where Ted DiBiase, Tony Atlas, and Robert Fuller defeat the Fabulous Freebirds, Buddy Roberts, Michael Hayes, and Terry Gordy. There's a lot to talk about here, Brandon.
There is, and I loved this period, and I loved the Freebirds. I did not love Robert Fuller. I don't know why. He was big enough and everything, but he wasn't my favorite partner that DiBiase had. I liked him better than Plowboy, I will say that. And it's just kind of seeing Tony Atlas in with him. I'm sure it was just thrown together for this show, but I'm sure it was a barn burner. Those guys faced each other all the time, so they knew each other really well. And I'm sure they had all their timing down, and the Birds were just hated so bad down there. And DiBiase was loved, and I guess, Fuller was over enough, and obviously Tony was over huge and just a stud. Not a great worker, but I liked him. So I'm sure that was probably a pretty damn fun match, depending on how much Hayes was, actually in the ring as well. And maybe there was a little bloodshed, who knows, because this was a really hot feud, them, the money and the Continental and all that stuff.
That's right.
Back and forth at the Omni. So you kind of got to shade it with that and look at those bigger cards at the Omni and how close they were to this date. And so there was definitely a lot of hatred in there. And, without looking it up, I don't know how far we were from them pile driving DiBiase and hurting him. But there was a lot of heat for this feud, so I'm sure it was a barn burner, especially in Columbus, And I don't know if was Fred Ward still around.
I think so
during this period, because I would love. Didn't he have his own TV show, or was it just the Macon that had the separate TV show?
I know Columbus had a separate TV at one point. As a matter of fact, it was in 1981 they had it. So
a few of those matches have popped up. There's an Austin Idol, Tommy Rich one, and then Paul Orndorff and somebody against Koloff, and there's 3 or 4 out there that are just awesome. And I wish a ton of those would turn up. That, to me, that would be holy grail type of stuff, because they sort of ran his own angles separate from what they were doing on the Georgia TV show itself. So who knows if there was a stip on this possibly that just isn't mentioned here. But damn, I'd love some of those to turn up, to see some of those, because what the little bit that's out there is really fun. And it sounds like they just announced live, just at the card every week from the few matches that are out there. Have you seen those, John?
2003. I am going through a pile of unmarked videotapes, and I put one in, and it's one of the Columbus shows that has, I think it was one with It was the Masked Superstar and Super Destroyer against Tommy Rich. And I'm trying to think. It wasn't Mr. Wrestling 2. It was Tommy Rich and one of the other big baby faces. And I was just like, where did this come from? What is this? And it was the Columbus stuff that I didn't even know existed.
Yeah, I was the same way. I think somebody might have posted it on Wrestling Classics, or I might have done that after I saw it and asked people if they'd seen it, because I hadn't seen it pop up. I just was YouTubing and it popped up as a suggestion, and there ended up being, those 4 or 5 matches. And then there's also a match out there with, I want to say, Steve Regal and somebody from a studio show, but maybe that was the Macon show instead of the Columbus show. Because, any of that stuff showing up would be great, but I likely never will, unfortunately.
No, I doubt. What I have was, it was just footage from the arena. It was done by a professional camera crew, but there was no commentary. So I figured it was just, footage filmed by the promotion. But then I hear that Columbus and Macon had their own television, so I don't know.
Well, and what was funny, the Tommy Rich Austin Idol match, for like the first 5 minutes, there is no commentary, and then some comes in, and then the Koloff and Orndorff and Masked Superstar matches, there are commentary on those. So maybe it was just a thing that they did for a few weeks to try out, and I don't know, but it'd be cool to see.
If anyone knows, please post it on our Facebook group, which I forgot to plug. But if you go to Facebook and put in Stick to Wrestling, our group will come up, and you are absolutely welcome to join. I mean, there's so much to say here. 3 guys who, in my opinion, could have been NWA World Heavyweight Champions in this match. Ted DiBiase, Terry Gordy, and yes, Tony Atlas. Even if Tony wasn't a good worker, he had it. And I've always been a big fan of Tony's. One angle they did where, I forget exactly how it went, but Michael Hayes won a match where, if the stipulations were that if he won the match, he would win Robert Fuller's Lincoln Continental. And I've seen it on film, Michael Hayes just on camera dangling the keys in front of the camera, like just baiting Robert Fuller. It was one of the best angles I'd ever seen. Michael Hayes, I think for whatever reason, 40 years later, he gets a bad rap. He was, at this time, a really good interview, and I thought he was a good enough wrestler.
Oh, yeah, I did too. It's funny how quick he fell off when he did, but at this point, he was just insanely good and so young is what was crazy about it. Still really young, and he looked cool. And it's funny to me. It's almost like how quick David Lee Roth went from cool to uncool and just really looking weird. And he sort of had that kind of same thing, the hair, and then once he was with Garvin, it was like, wow, it's just not the same. And maybe it was the little bit of extra weight. But, a ton of guys didn't have super long hair back in 81, except guys like him and, the Skinnerd guys and your Almonds and those type of guys and some of the rockers. But most guys just didn't, unlike today or the 80s and whatnot. So, yeah, I thought he was really special, him and Gordy, and it was nice having Roberts in there to kind of maybe take the pins here and there and sort of be a workhorse or whatever, because he'd been around forever, and I'm sure he got some really good paydays out of that, run towards the end that he might not have gotten otherwise. So,
I mean, the joke going around in 88 was that 1988, David Lee Roth didn't fall off a cliff. He fell off a skyscraper. And in 89, Michael Hayes fell off the skyscraper. And I think the whole thing was, it just felt like Michael Hayes, at the age of 29, burned out of the business. He just lost interest.
Yeah, well, they'd had quite a schedule, and he'd gone from, what was he, 17, 18 when they got in, and you get that success so fast, and, he probably lasted longer than he might have should have with the success they had and his partying and all their partying, the birds were kind of known. And, if you piss off Andre the Giant for being a little drunk, then, you're probably overdoing it a little bit, because he could put it away himself. But yeah, he definitely fell off a cliff, but not in this period. I mean, they were just on fire right here, and he still looked cool. And they had the Confederate stuff, but it was 81 and their outfits always looked cool. It's problematic now looking back on it, but at the time we didn't think that way, unfortunately. And it didn't seem to be as big of a problem as it is today, but they were just on fire here. And I agree with Tony Atlas too. I liked him. I think he probably could have been the NWA champ as well. He had a bunch of title shots versus Harley at the Omni and even a cage match. And I think the fans would have accepted it for sure. No doubt.
Yeah. I mean, and just to give you guys an idea of what a different world it was. I mean, this is 81 and I was a sophomore at Nashua High School and there weren't very many black kids. I would say probably like 10%. And one of them, who I was friends with, had a jacket with a Confederate flag, big Confederate flag on the back. And underneath, it said rock and roll N-word, except it didn't say N-word. And this is like what he chose to wear. It was just a different world.
Yeah, now that's pretty shocking.
In Nashua, New Hampshire.
Yeah, that's crazy. And, I grew up in a small town in Illinois, Southern Illinois, and I would say if there was 20 black kids in school, that might be pushing it. But my graduating class was literally 64 people.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And the school overall, I think, had about 640 some, it varied, but the town was only 9,800 people. So, and, things were definitely different, but we didn't think anything, about them any different because there was just so few of us. So they just kind of felt like part of the whole family, but there just wasn't many in town. And there was a town just 7 miles away that literally had 0 black families. And that kind of shocked me. And it's changed now, but it's just kind of amazing, how things used to be. I'm just blown away by that jacket. That's just craziness to me.
It was crazy 40 years ago, but you can only imagine now. I mean, when I was a little kid, I lived in Queens, and of course, there's a lot of blacks, a lot of Hispanics, and then we moved to
everybody.
Yeah, I mean, it's Queens. It's a big mixing pot, and then we moved to little old North Attleboro, Massachusetts, and there are 0 black kids, 0 Hispanic kids. It was quite the culture shock to me. And we finally had a black kid move in when I was in the middle of 7th grade, and I'm not sure what it was like what it was like where anywhere else grew up. But I mean, we were very, you didn't sit at our table, right? I mean, we were a very exclusive group, and if you're not in, you don't get to hang with us. And me and my friend, we walk up to this black kid. I'm like, hey, are you going to play football next year? He's like, yeah. Well, you might as well sit with us then. So it was a very weird sociological experiment. But anyway.
Well, and it had to have been tough for the kid, too, being the only kid, So you guys did the right and decent thing. So that's good.
No, and yeah, that's the thing. I mean, we at least wanted him to feel welcome. His name was Matt. He was a cool guy. It all worked out. Anyway. 5th and final match, the Mongolian Stomper defeats Mr. Wrestling 2. What do you think, Brandon?
Wow, that would have been a pretty damn good match. The Stomper scared the hell out of me the first time I saw him. Just a scary looking guy and in incredible shape. And Don Carson wasn't the greatest manager, but he was pretty good with him, I thought, playing him up. And I forget what that thing was called that he was always out there bending that, the flex steel thing. And he was just massive in those boots and his kicks and everything. I thought he was great. from reading in several different books, I guess maybe Gary Hart's book, he either, had maybe not emotional problems or whatever, but either depression or something. And he'd, stick around a place for just a little while and just ghost everybody. He wouldn't tell him he was going and then just be gone. So I'm surprised he got some of the opportunities that he got coming back places, but I guess he drew money enough that they overlooked it, and then wrestling too was just a giant in Georgia. Just, I forget who asked the question, I think just yesterday on the group, whether him and Rich were the number one. And that's kind of hard to say, I'd say Tommy, I guess, but 2 was there from 73 on and just massive star. And boy, what another 10, 12 years of paychecks that gimmick put in his pocket. He was, going to be done as Johnny Walker. He looked old already. And, thank God Woods left and Jarrett had to, try to do something. And thank God he agreed to do it, because I'd say that set his retirement up at least fairly decently if he was frugal at all, Just massive run there. And then between there and the Mid-South, and I didn't get Florida all the time, but I know he made shots down there as well. So he just got a brand new lease on life. And it's funny, I had never heard of Johnny Walker ever. And one of the first things I did when I got the internet, I might have mentioned this before, was finding wrestling sites and who the heck was Mr. Wrestling 2. And when I found out it was Johnny Walker, I'm like, well, who the hell's that? I'd never heard of the guy. And obviously I realized that I was wrong, and he was somebody and had been around for a damn long time and was a big star in Florida and Tennessee and other places. So I'm sure, as long as the crowd was decent and he wasn't in a bad mood that night, that could have been a really nice main event for that show.
Mongolian Stomper, I did not like him, and I'll tell you why. The gimmick worked. He was obviously in great shape, but I looked at him and I was like, all right, number one, he's old. And number two, like, you wouldn't have a guy playing goalie for the Bruins called the Mongolian Stomper. You wouldn't have a guy on the mound for the Boston Red Sox called the Mongolian Stomper. Like, I wanted the wrestlers to have names. I didn't want Abdullah the Butcher, Mongolian Stomper, etc., unless you were wearing a mask. That was different. I've grown to appreciate him over the years, meeting Mongolian Stomper. But at the time, I was like, I don't like this stuff. Don Carson, let's just say the stories are out there. Mr. Wrestling 2, I absolutely love the guy. I thought he was a great babyface interview. He came across as a little bit cantankerous, which actually worked to his credit. And we talked about, Tommy Rich versus Mr. Wrestling 2. Mr. Wrestling 2 was the top babyface in Georgia until Tommy Rich took that away from him. I want to say 1979 for sure. And when Tommy left for Memphis and came back, Tommy was clearly the number one at that point, which is right around the time we're speaking about. And they had an angle mapped out where Mr. Wrestling 2 was going to turn heel on Tommy Rich, much in the same way that he eventually turned on Magnum TA, and they backed out of it. Now, you know what? I've always said don't turn babyface legends, and 2 wasn't a legend in Louisiana, so I was 100% fine with that. That was probably the greatest storyline in wrestling history, but I'm glad they didn't turn him in Georgia.
Actually, I agree with you there, because then what do? It's kind of like, Vince Sr. not liking the babyface matchups, because then, where can you really go with it? One guy might lose a bit of his luster, and why take any box office off of them at all if you don't have to? But yeah, in Georgia, it wouldn't have worked at all. Maybe for a little bit, but I think it could have ended up hurting both of them. But I'm with you. The whole deal with TA and Mid-South was just done to perfection. He was so cranky, and cantankerous, and you could tell he was older from his body, but he could still go, and he was just like the perfect asshole coach, that everybody kind of had and run into. And
yeah,
his interviews were just awesome, and that whole thing was just gold, and they made a lot of money with it too. So, and it really set TA up. I wasn't a huge fan of his before that. I had only kind of seen him in the magazines, and then just watching that play out at the time only through the magazines, I started liking out TA more. So it definitely did its job, and
oh yeah, that definitely got TA over as a top babyface. Like, he didn't have that. He came across as kind of a not a main eventer, like not quite a middle of the card guy, better than that. But once like they did that feud with Mr. Wrestling 2, and he finally vanquished Mr. Wrestling 2 and the new Mr. Wrestling 3 or whatever he was, and he was now the North American champion. Like, he was a star after that.
Yeah, and there's the genius of Bill Watts, at least some of the time, because he sure knew how to put things together and put things with guys that at least he knew would do what he wanted and would pull off what he wanted and could add some of their own to it as well. And boy, they did it,
Yeah, I mean, I thought the greatest storyline in wrestling history, and that is available on WWE Network if you would like to watch that. All right, which show should we do next? I'll tell you what, this show, the last 3 episodes have been very WWF-centric, so I want to at least step away from that for one show. We will go with a Championship Wrestling from Florida Miami show. January 21st, 1981. The opener is Hans Schroeder going over Bubba Douglas. Bubba, any thoughts on these guys?
Hans, I had only seen 2 or 3 times on MSG cards, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
And then I didn't get the Mid-South stuff until later. So I've only recently seen him a bunch from watching some of the Mid-South. He was a big guy. I know he had a pretty decent career, wasn't huge or anything. Nothing really special. He looked tough enough, but, just kind of unassuming and no real thoughts on the guy. Like I said, I guess he looked tough enough and all that, but nothing really stood out, at least by that time. Maybe he was really something a few years before. And then Bubba Douglas, I didn't get to see a whole lot of him, but I know he was pretty beloved in Florida and was the mayor of
Lakeland.
Lakeland, there you go. So, he was so beloved, he could take the losses, and the fans down there didn't care, so.
Yeah. Hans Schroeder, he had a couple of WWF runs as an undercard guy. I do remember him in Florida because I got it on cable at this point. He came out with a riding crop, slamming it on the desk and demanding a match with Barry. He kept calling him Barry Wimpham. And it was in the worst fake German accent known to man. Even, at 15 years old, I could see right through this guy. But he wasn't bad. Bubba Douglas, I remember, lost a hair match to Sir Oliver Humperdink right around this time. So it's the opening match. We don't have a lot. Match number 2, the masked Superfly defeats Reggie Parks. Are you familiar with the Superfly?
Now, yes, and I'm wondering exactly which one that would be. I'm thinking the large black fellow, but it was somebody famous at one time. Was it not Kareem Muhammad? Or because I believe he worked in Kansas City quite a bit as well.
I think it was Ray Candy, which is Kareem Muhammad.
Yes. Okay, yeah. So I was sort of right there. But no, I never saw him work this gimmick. I've only seen ads for it, from Kansas City, and actually had zero clue he worked Florida under this gimmick at all.
I think it was Ray Candy.
It probably was, because the guy was always large, and, I guess, I don't even know. I guess he would have been working as a heel here against Reggie Parks, and About the only thing I really know about Reggie is he made belts and he had a great physique as well. And he definitely seemed to know what he was doing in the ring, but he was a smidge before my time, I guess. He definitely looked older, at least facially at the time, kind of like you mentioned with the Stomper, which was absolutely true with, even though having a good physique, you could just see in the face he'd been around the block a few times. So
yeah, Reggie Parks was losing matches on TV regularly at this point. And I remember seeing his name in magazines, and he was a bigger star in the 70s, but now it kind of felt like he lived in Florida and just went on the road, made a few bucks, knowing that his career essentially was over. Superfly, they did something in Florida where, and I talked about this on the show maybe 2 years ago, so please bear with me as I tell the story again. Mass Superfly was in Florida. He was a large black man who wore a big bodysuit that was like 2 different colors on each side, and he was doing the loaded boot gimmick. And Sir Oliver Humperdink was a babyface. He'd been a babyface for about 8 or 9 months, and Sir Oliver Humperdink was at the desk, and Gordon Soley happened to mention the boot. And Sir Oliver Humperdink like, "Oh no, Gordon, he has a birth defect. One of his legs is shorter than the other one, so he has to wear that boot." And I'm like, well, how does he know that? I was like, what's going on here? A week or 2 weeks later, Sir Oliver Humperdink was a bad guy again. But anyway, it was just brilliant storytelling, though. Like, they gave you that tiny little hint that something was amiss, and yeah, it was. Next match,
yeah, but it could have been plausible, but not likely, but plausible.
Yeah. Next match, Scott Mcgee, who was just starting out here, defeats the Scorpion. Just so everyone knows, the Scorpion was just a generic mass television jobber. Any thoughts on Scott Mcgee?
Yeah, he was another one of those guys that if he would have been a little bit taller, probably would have done a lot more. Because he definitely had fire during his comebacks and fighting out from underneath the bigger guys. I've seen a couple of cool matches of his from Florida. I can't remember against who, but he blades and just had a lot of fire. And unfortunately, he was just small. And his dad was so, was his dad Tony Charles? Is that correct? Or am I thinking of somebody else?
No, I don't think Tony Charles and Scott Mcgee are related, but I could be wrong. I know Scott McGee's dad was a wrestler.
Okay, yeah, because he was a good mat technician as well. So once again, another of those guys that probably could have done a little bit more had he been a smidge bigger. He was sort of like a Rick McGraw to me.
Yeah.
About the same height, and they were thick as hell, but without that few extra inches of height, you just wonder what some of them could have done had they had that just little bit more. What if Mike Graham would have been 6'2",
Yeah. And by the way, Lou to the rescue, Jeff Port, who was still wrestling in Florida, much in a Reggie Parks role, was his dad. Scott McGee's real name was Garfield Ports. Scott McGee, like you said, he was a good wrestler. He was a little bit small, especially as the 80s went on. That became a bigger and bigger issue. He's probably best known either for his run in the WWF, which is like 85, 86, and he was just another guy. What can I say? But he was Florida champion in 1983 when he beat Ron Bass for the title in like 4 seconds or 6 seconds, something like that. And Ron Bass was the main heel, the by far the number one heel in the area. And, for Scott to get that kind of a push, like I said, it was like we were talking about Charlie Cook. Sometimes they would just put the Florida title on a random babyface, and sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. This is kind of one of the times where it was in the middle.
Sure. Yeah. I know he had his fans and they got to try things out like that. And, Jerry Jarrett did that for a lot of guys. He'd put a belt on him and it was like, hey, man, sink or swim. Here's your chance. And he definitely did that with Paul Orndorff in the Southern title because Eddie Graham was like, I'm going to get rid of this guy, and can you do anything with him? And he brought him up and pretty much immediately put the Southern belt on him. And it was like, all right, dude, do it or don't. But here's your shot. And he did it. So it really helped him. And maybe that was, the thinking with some of that stuff like that. Hey, here's your shot. Let's see what you can really do, if we really push you.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes the belt makes the wrestler. Sometimes the wrestler makes the belt. This is one of the times where the belt made the wrestler. Jack Briscoe defends the NWA Florida TV title by defeating Baron von Rashka on a disqualification. What do you got for us, Brandon?
Oh, well, God, I mean, what hasn't been said about Jack Briscoe? I always liked him. He was always fun in St. Louis, I thought. Great technician, obviously a legit amateur that could really go. Sometimes he got a little bit thin, I thought, when he got...
That's a good point.
Being literally thin, lost just even a few pounds. He looked a little older. But, just a legend, and it's hard to really dog the guy. He pretty much did it all. He was sort of a homesteader by this time in Florida, and the people had seen him, forever by this point, but still plenty popular. And then in 81, Von Rashka wasn't quite that bad yet, and he was another legit amateur guy. So, they might have had a pretty entertaining match. It just depends on what the people wanted to see that night. Was it a brawl, or maybe they did a lot of mat-based stuff? But if I guess looking at it, if it was by DQ, I guess they could have had a mat-based thing, and then Baron starts, hammering him or whatever. But it could have been a decent match, I think.
I think it probably was a good match. Jack Briscoe, the first time I saw him, and this is 1980, probably fall or summer 1980, I had been watching wrestling for like 4 years, and this is the first time I saw Jack Briscoe, I was like, oh my God, this guy is so good. It was the first time I'd ever said that about anybody. Like, he just stood out as just an amazing wrestler.
He was so smooth.
Yes.
That's the word I can think of, was just he was smooth.
Yeah, he was. I mean, and I know this was towards the end of his career. He'd be gone in 4 years, but I mean, it was the first time, like I said, that I was like, someone stood out to me as an outstanding wrestler. And then right around this time, he wrestled Buzz Sawyer on TV, and it was one of the best matches I'd ever seen. I mean, it was, a short match, obviously, like 7 or 8 minutes, but both of those guys were tremendous. This was the best Baron von Rashka. He was managed by Lord Alfred Hayes, and he would come on TV wearing a suit, and he would just be so super serious. He wouldn't be clownish or anything. And he came across as this, just really arrogant German guy, which he wasn't. But, I totally bought him. I absolutely loved him at this point.
Yeah, this was definitely, he was better elsewhere, I thought, than any of his AWA stuff. That was always way too cartoony and clowny. But I liked him in Georgia in 1980 when he was Georgia champ. And then, at least in the magazines here, he just seemed a little more vicious outside of the AWA. Now, granted, I didn't see his earlier 70s stuff. Maybe he was more like that back then. But I'd have to agree with you about this probably being one of the best versions of Baron.
I mean,
and Hayes was great as a smarmy little English dude, too.
Yes, he was. I mean, we've talked about how great I think Lord Alfred Hayes was in Florida on this show plenty of times. When Baron von Rashka was in the WWF, he would get on TV and do an interview, and he would put his left hand on his right wrist and make the claw thing with his hand, and he'd make funny faces and talk weird, and he was totally different here in Florida. I wish there was more footage of this, because I thought the guy was great. I don't know why he didn't keep it up, because when he was in Georgia the year before, he was still like the clownish Baron von Rashka.
Yeah, and that's where I first saw him. I might have seen him on Wrestling at the Chase, but Sam had him toned down.
Yes.
They called him Von Rashka.
Yes, they did.
Baron Von Rashka. So if I saw him then, I don't remember. And I know he had a few, came in a few times, but he didn't stand out to me, at least when I was in that beginning stages of just, starting to remember angles and that kind of thing. So.
Yeah, I remember the first time I saw those St. Louis tapes, and he was announced as just Von Rashka. I'm like, okay, this guy's going through the Sam Mushnick filter.
Yeah.
Mike Graham over R.T. Tyler. Any thoughts on either of these guys?
Well, sort of talked about Graham earlier. Obviously, he could wrestle. And God, he was strong as an ox, obviously, for being his size. And I think he did fairly well what a huge shadow to be under.
Yes.
Especially in Florida. Eddie Graham was a legend, not only in wrestling, but just in everything around, the Sheriff's Boys Ranch and Civic things, and just a pillar of a lot of communities there, and made a lot of money for a lot of fundraisers, I'm sure, for a ton of different schools. And just to kind of be under that shadow has got to be rough on a kid, especially if you're going to come up and, be in the same profession. So, and then he was cursed, I hate to say cursed, but with his height, and that just held him back a lot. That's why I said just a bit ago, what if he was 6'1" or even 6 foot instead of 5'7" or whatever? He could have really been something, I think, because technically he was definitely sound, and I'm sure he at least just through osmosis would have had to glean some of Eddie's brilliance on finishes and things. So I know later on some of his shoots and stuff, he came across really poorly, I thought, and thought he knew way more than, he did, or was just flat out lying. But at the time he was serviceable. And R.T. Tyler, I don't remember much about him. He sort of reminds me of a Buzz Tyler type of guy. I really only remember him from the magazines. So that's about my only thought on all RT there.
In 1981, I would have accepted Mike Graham as the NWA World's Heavyweight Champion. That's how over he was with me. I thought he, and again, I watched the Florida TV, and I thought he was fantastic. And again, a real genuine threat to Harley Race at this point. And I remember, I started getting the Observer at the end of '86, and I start reading about, Mike Graham sucks. I'm like, get out of here. Mike Graham's great. And I still think that. I'm still a big fan of his.
Well, I think there's nothing wrong with that, because, I'd rather have my own perception of somebody, because say you had never seen Mike Graham before and you got the Observers and you watched him and had a preconceived notion already and just kind of dismissed him. So your reaction to him, to me, was more pure than have read something and not like him already because you'd read that. So
right.
I don't think there's anything wrong with that at all.
I didn't agree with everything that was in the Observer. I agreed with a lot of it. I remember.
Oh, Dave's awesome. I mean, I love him, and I wish I would have found out about it way earlier. And I guess I was just so young, because I saw him in some of the magazines, but I was just so young. I guess I was afraid to send off for things yet, until I would have hit 15 or so. And I just never pulled the trigger until after 88, 89 or so. I wish I would have done it well before.
Oh, same here. And honestly, I never even thought about getting a newsletter. I wanted a magazine. I wanted someone sending out. I didn't want to read something that I could have just as easily put out, or at least I thought that, But
right.
I started getting the Observer. It was December 1986. I got home late from a Christmas party. I told the story before, and he sent me some complimentary issues, and I was up until literally daylight reading this stuff. And I got it at the right time, because I think I was burning out of being like just an aftermag fan, and the WWF was changing, and there was so much, wrestling was changing, and I think I got it at the exact right time, because otherwise I wouldn't be surprised if I had not lasted as a fan after 1987 without that.
Sure, it pulled back the curtain just enough for you to get a little bit reinterested in it, and seeing some things maybe you didn't know. And I kind of agree, because I watched through, the time I was 16 and 18 and stuff, but, the guitar and girls were a little more important, but my eye was, an ear was, at least one of them was on what was happening. So, but then it was funny, once 1990 hit, which wasn't the greatest year, and I turned 20, I just kind of went full back in, because some of the magazines started coming out that did pull the cover back a little, and I'd learned about Meltzer and those guys, and I think that's what kind of rekindled my interest as well. And I've already mentioned, getting the internet was hilarious. Besides looking for some tits, the first things I wanted to look at was, if there was any old wrestling stuff on there. And I'm sure I'm not the only one that was like that.
No, definitely not. I mean, unfortunately, people would come to me for information, which I was always happy to help out with. And then, I would occasionally run into a guy who, knew more than I did. Like, I thought, okay, Meltzer knows everything. Then the next level down is me, Jeff Bowder, and a couple of other people, and then that's it. And when I got on the internet, I found out that was not the case. Plenty of
there were so many guys that loved it that you just didn't know. And I loved finding RSPW, and I guess I always went to the news from Dayton and Mikasa and just all those different sites back then. It was so much fun, especially when the WCW WWF thing really took off there in 96 or whenever, the whole Nitro came around. That was just a really fun period, at least for me,
Oh, totally.
And reading stuff, literally news might come out 3 or 4 times a day, and I was checking it, and it's like, dude, you're 26, man, and you're checking this stuff 3 and 4 times a day. But it was a lot of fun, So,
well, it's funny you mentioned that, you were trying to fit it all in, girls, the guitar, wrestling. Like, I mean, I fit it all in. I mean, my girlfriends knew, like, we're not leaving until 8:05. That's it on Saturday night, and no matter what her various girlfriend circumstances were, I was in my friend Joe's basement at midnight every single time, because that's when WWF wrestling was on. Like, it doesn't matter what was going on. Yeah, it's great that your parents are out of town, honey, but I gotta go.
We can do that another time. There's always another time.
All right, 2-ring 18-man battle royal won by Dick Slater. My own opinion is that the 2-ring battle royals, battle royals suck anyway, but the 2-ring battle royals were the worst, because basically there was too much space. No matter what, you couldn't see anything.
Yes, and I always hated the 2-ring thing. A couple of the war games were really cool, so I guess I need to put that caveat in there. But it sort of ripped you off for the week if you had front row tickets, because there was 2 rings, and I don't know if they did it in Florida like they did it later on, if they'd have, one match in one ring, then go to the other ring, so the other side, switched back and forth between rings just during the regular matches. But
yeah,
I just didn't like the look of it. It was almost to me like I don't like concerts in the round. I don't know why. I want them to be at the end of the damn, arena with their stuff. I just don't like it. And I think the 2 rings always made me think of a concert in the round. It sort of ripped off one side of the crowd that had paid for ringside, because now you're 30 feet farther away than you were, before. But they didn't do them that often. And I'm sure there were some people that dug the gimmick, but I'm like you, they always just kind of sucked. And I know I've heard a lot of guys say they hated them because you're always waiting for somebody to step on your ankle while you're not looking, or, just too easy to get hurt with inadvertently.
Yeah, exactly. Now, Dick Slater wins this. He was in the middle of getting a big push. I, as everyone who listens to this podcast knows, is a huge fan of late 70s, early to mid 80s Dick Slater. I think he could have carried the NWA title. As a matter of fact, I know at one point he was under consideration to carry the NWA title. He was the champion and lead heel everywhere he went. A tremendously underrated wrestler, in my opinion.
Oh, I thought he was awesome. Yeah, and he was Missouri champ, and he definitely could have. And I would have loved to see him in Georgia, his feud with Wrestling 2 in 76 and 77, and him and Orton Jr. as tag champs there. Yeah, he did it all, and he was great. He did sort of, become a bit of a Terry Funk clone a little later, maybe, but
yeah,
that didn't bug me that much. There were guys that were similar, but he was just double tough and a character. And I was always happy to see, if he hadn't been on Georgia TV for a while and they were announcing one of the cards and Mr. Unpredictable Dick Slater, Gordon would say, and it always fired me up. So I loved the guy.
There's a story out there, and I believe the story, okay? I've heard it from enough guys who are around the territory. John Matuzak was playing football at USF, and he was working the door at a strip joint. And Dick Slater's in high school, and he wants to go in the strip joint, and he beat the crap out of Matuzak.
I'd heard that too. And
as a high school kid.
He was just, there's just kids like that, like Terry Gordy. I mean, hell, that match from the IWA where he's 15, it's like he doesn't look 15 there. I mean, that's a grown ass man already. Maybe
Ernie Ladd
not, but it's just crazy. So yeah, I believe that. I mean, it just out there too much, for it to. There's got to be some truth to it.
I think I'm going to name this show "Cruising with the Twos." Anyway. Our final match, and I can't believe it. We've already gone the 60 minutes. This is the fastest hour for me every single week. Dusty Rhodes and Sweet Brown Sugar, a.k.a. Skip Young under a mask, defeated Ole Anderson and Assassin #1 in the main event. Share your thoughts with us, Brandon.
I think this could have been really, really good. I wasn't a huge Sweet Brown Sugar fan. He could move. I liked him better with the mask than off.
Definitely.
He was a stud, but something about his face was too nice to me. I don't know. He just looked great with that black and white mask. I thought that one looked the best to me personally. And Dusty, obviously a legend, especially at this point, and they're facing two of his all-time nemesises, especially from this period.
Yeah,
Ole and the Assassin. So I'd say it was a pretty hot match, especially being Miami. They always had great crowds, and I don't think Dusty ever minded blading any time, no matter where they were. So it was probably a pretty damn good match, and I would have loved to have seen it, actually.
I was watching some Florida wrestling from 1987 earlier this week, and it was right around the time the Crockett guys started coming in, and Dusty did an interview. His forehead had to be seen to be believed. I mean, it was such a friggin' mess. It was just,
I don't know how he did it. I mean, that had to have been sore all the time, and I know it was a badge of courage for some of them, but it just got crazy, some of them. And, Albano's head would look like that at times as well, and King Curtis, and then who's the guy in the Lucha Libre, one of the Viano guys.
Oh,
his
okay.
chin was all gigged up. Or Mad Dog. Oh hell, I can't remember his name, but just Abdullah type, gashes in the head. So some of these guys were definitely blade freaks,
Yeah. Dusty, well, first of all, I agree with you that Sweet Brown Sugar was way better with the mask right around this time. By the way, it was Lou to the rescue again. Pero Aguayo Sr.
Yes, that's
the guy you were referring to.
Name. It's just insane. Look up some pictures of him. It's just incredible.
Anyway, yeah, Sweet Brown Sugar, right around this time, he had a match, and I don't remember who it was against, but he announced that, win, lose, or draw, I am unmasking after this match, which probably drew a great crowd. But I mean, even the first time I saw him in the magazines in '79, I'm like, okay, that's Skip Young. What are we doing here? That's the most obvious thing in the world. Another guy they experimented putting the Florida title on at least once, I think maybe twice. Dusty Rhodes, what can you say? He's probably a little bit past his prime in Florida, but his prime was incredible in Florida. I do remember Ole Anderson making the trip up from Georgia, doing an interview saying he was specifically coming to Florida to go after Dusty Rhodes. So this is obviously right around that time. And, the Assassin, one of the best interviews in the game. He was just a vicious, dirty heel. He was one of the best ever. I mean, he just stood out as, a legend to me at this point.
Yeah, I loved him too. And watching him on Georgia just sealed all that stuff. His feud with Dusty and the stuff with 2 and Wrestling 1, the episode where they both pulled each other's mask off, and the episode with just the in-depth interview, and which was I think the same show. Yeah, just a great talker, and people don't realize how young Jody was, and when he's 17 and headlined Madison Square Garden with his brother, I believe so. So he'd been around.
No, he'd been around since the '60s.
And, the Mauler, I didn't see much of him until later. He was always fun, but I definitely liked the Assassin the better, and the team of the Assassins. And Jody was just awesome, just incredible.
Yeah. I mean, he was the heel that I hated the most because, he was just such a rotten, dirty guy. I remember we talked about this maybe 2 years ago, he suckered Dusty Rhodes on TV. And Dusty's laying on the floor and he's yelling, "Get that garbage out of here. Someone pick up that garbage and get it out of here." Oh, my God, what a nasty thing to say to someone.
Well, yeah, and the best part, he was so matter of fact, kind of like Buddy Colt. He didn't have to yell and scream, and you believed him, man. You believed every word he said. He was just menacing as hell,
yes.
I guess is the best word for him.
That is the best word. Brandon, this show has gone by so fast. I'm sitting here talking about we've got like 8 shows in front of us, and I'm so smart. I'm like, okay, if we get through all of these, we'll head over to 1991. We got through 2 of the shows.
Well, that's fun. It went fast for me too, and I definitely always enjoy coming on and talking with you about stuff because and sorry I go off on tangents.
No, that's what you're here for.
It's hard not to at times. It just sparks little things that you think of. So always fun, man.
You had a graduating class of how many people?
64.
I had like 964. It was like 900 something. And I always wondered what it was like. Like I went to a huge high school, obviously, and a small college. And I've always wondered, like, can I please be reincarnated and find out what it's like going to a small high school and then a big college?
Well, it was crazy. And this is funny. Nancy Grace has a new show on. I don't like her, but I sort of like murder mysteries. I'll make this real quick. We had a kid we went to school with. He ended up shooting a guy when we were 15, sophomore year. Killed the guy. He went to prison until he was 21. He got out. And in 2012 or 2013, we find out he's been a serial killer. And he's killed like 6 people that we know of. The show's called Nancy Grace, Injustice with Nancy Grace. But there's a whole show on this kid that was in my class that I went to high school with, that sat in the library, with, and chop this dude up with a hatchet while he's driving down the highway. It's just insane. So, but my point was, I was talking to my daughter about it, and I'm like, and sweetie, you got to understand, we had 64 people. We all knew each other really well. This wasn't just some guy that I might have passed in the hallway once. We interacted with this guy every single day, and his name was John Bridges. It was just crazy to hear about that,
Wow. So you get 64 people in your class, and you get this one special guy. I've got like 950 people, and one of the girls is on the pro bowling tour. That's the best I've got. All right.
I'd
Listen,
rather have
Brent,
the bowling tour.
what's that?
I said I'd rather have the bowling tour, girl.
Brendan, thank you again. I want to thank Lightning Lou Kippelman, our awesome producer, for all the work he does. I want to thank everyone for listening. We will see you next week. This has been a production of the Arcadian Vanguard Podcast Network.
This concludes our podcast day.